It was supposed to be a routine delivery. 3 bags of groceries, a receipt to sign, and a polite smile exchanged at the door. But life doesn't always follow the script. Sometimes, it takes a single question, asked with sincerity in the silence, between strangers, to change the trajectory of 2 lives. I didn't know it that day, but when she opened her door and said, "Would you mind staying for dinner?" It wasn't just about food. It was the beginning of something I never expected. Something real. Something slow-burning and unshakably human. Because that wasn't just dinner. It was a doorway. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her name was Helen, and the first thing I noticed wasn't her age or her smile. It was the way she stood in the doorway, like the storm outside didn't faze her at all. It was late September, the kind of day where the rain comes sideways and the wind stings your face just enough to remind you summer's over. I was on my 4th delivery of the shift, soaking wet, with a paper bag beginning to tear under the weight of canned soup and frozen vegetables. I barely looked up when I rang the bell. But when the door swung open, everything paused for just a second. Not because she was striking or flashy. No, she wasn't that kind of woman. But because there was something grounded about her. Like, she had roots. And for someone like me, drifting between towns and jobs, that kind of thing makes you pause. She reached out immediately to help take the bag, her hands steady but gentle. "You're soaked," she said. "Come in for a moment, at least." And I hesitated. Of course, I always do. Boundaries, rules. Don't cross the line between customer and driver. But something in her voice wasn't pushy. It was maternal? No, not that. It was human. Just a person asking another person to get out of the rain. Inside was warm in a way most houses aren't anymore. Not just heat, but warmth. You could feel it in the creak of the old hardwood floors, in the faint scent of cinnamon tea lingering in the kitchen, in the sound of a radio playing softly from another room. Something from the 60s, maybe. I stood there dripping, apologizing, while she disappeared to grab a towel. She came back with 2, one for my head and one for my shoes. She laughed when I said thank you like it was too much. "Don't thank me," she said. "I'm just paying back the universe for the people who did the same for me." That sentence stuck with me, even though I didn't know why yet. She put the groceries on the kitchen counter and opened the fridge, scanning it like she wasn't sure what she was looking for. "I was about to throw something together," she said casually. "But honestly, I hate cooking for just one. Would you stay for dinner?" I laughed, thinking it was a joke. She looked at me, straight-faced. "I'm serious. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who gets flustered easily. I've eaten lunch on loading docks, in alleyways, under flickering gas station lights. But something about the offer caught me off guard. Maybe because it was so genuine. So uncalculated. I glanced at the clock. I had 2 more deliveries, technically. But one was to a guy who always tipped in expired coupons, and the other was a no-contact drop-off outside town. I could make it work. And something in me, something tired and hungry and maybe a little lonely, said yes before I even realized it. She smiled and nodded, like she expected me to say yes all along. She pulled out a pot, started boiling water, and asked if I liked pasta. I said, of course. She moved around the kitchen with a calm rhythm, like someone who'd cooked the same way for years. No recipes, no rush. Just intuition. I stood awkwardly at first, then leaned against the counter, then eventually sat at the small wooden table near the window. It overlooked a backyard that was mostly trees and one crooked bird bath. She saw me looking. "Used to be full of flowers," she said. "Now the birds come more than people do." I nodded. I didn't know what to say. She didn't fill the silence with questions, which I appreciated. Instead, she talked about the neighborhood, how the bakery on the corner used to be a movie theater, how the mailman had a limp from the war but still walked every route himself. Her voice was soft but steady, like someone who had a lot to say but had learned not to say it all at once. Dinner was simple. Spaghetti with garlic bread and a side salad that looked like it came from a backyard garden, not a store. We ate slowly, without the rush of a workday or a television in the background. And then she said it, mid-bite, like it had been on her mind for a while. "Would you stay with me, even if I'm 52? I froze. I looked up. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't joking. She wasn't even trying to be romantic. It wasn't about me at all. It was a question tossed into the air like a stone into a pond. "Would you stay, even if?" I didn't know what to say. But I knew this. The moment she asked that, the dynamic shifted. This wasn't about groceries anymore. This wasn't about dinner. This was a story unraveling slowly in front of me, and I had a feeling I'd just stepped into the first chapter. The question lingered between us longer than the steam rising from the pasta, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't expecting a real answer. Not then. Not in that moment. It wasn't the kind of question you ask a stranger who just delivered your groceries. It was the kind of question someone asks when they've been holding something in their chest for a long time. Something unsaid, unanswered, maybe even unheard. I watched her carefully, unsure whether I should pretend it didn't happen or lean into it. She didn't look embarrassed, just calm, like she had finally exhaled after holding her breath for too many years. I took another bite to buy myself time. The food, strangely enough, helped center me. It reminded me this was real, not some dream where mysterious women asked life-altering questions over spaghetti. She finally broke the silence by laughing softly, shaking her head like she could read my discomfort. "Don't worry," she said. "I say strange things sometimes. It's probably the weather." But it wasn't the weather. I knew that. And I think she did too. Still, we moved on from it for now, by talking about smaller things. Safe topics like how she'd moved into the house 10 years ago after her divorce, how the grocery store had replaced an old farmer's market, and how the squirrels in the yard had become bold enough to chew through the side of her compost bin. I told her about the delivery job, about how I'd only meant to do it for a few months but kept putting off the next step, and how each town I passed through felt a little less like a stop and a little more like a place I was never meant to stay. She listened without interrupting, her hands resting gently on the edge of the table, her eyes occasionally glancing out the window as if she was trying to picture my stories coming to life beyond the glass. There was a comfort in it, that quiet attention, the kind people rarely give one another anymore. After dinner, she rinsed the dishes while I dried them, both of us moving in sync as though we'd done it 100 times before. The house didn't feel like a stranger's house anymore. It felt like something familiar, like a coat you forgot you once wore that still fits. She asked if I wanted tea, and when I nodded, she disappeared for a minute and came back with 2 mismatched mugs, each filled with something that smelled faintly of mint and honey. We sat on the couch in the living room, and I noticed how the room was filled with photos. Not posed portraits, but candid snapshots of laughter, of half-finished puzzles, of people mid-movement. She noticed me scanning them. "Most of them are from years ago," she said. "Friends, family, moments that slipped away but left their echoes here." I nodded. I didn't have many photos. My life didn't leave many echoes like that. I told her this, and she looked at me the way people do when they understand loneliness more than they care to admit. She sipped her tea, and then asked, "Is it hard being untethered?" The word caught me off guard. Untethered. It sounded poetic, but painful. I thought about it for a moment. "Sometimes," I said, "it's peaceful until you realize you're always waiting to belong somewhere again." She nodded. "I know that feeling." And for the first time since I arrived, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not sadness exactly, but memory. The kind that tugs gently at the heart, reminding it of things it once tried to forget. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The clock ticked quietly behind us. The storm had passed, and outside the window, the streetlights flickered on one by one, like little beacons in the darkness. I knew I should go. I had other stops to make, a shift to finish, and a life to return to, that was waiting somewhere, just outside this pocket of peace. But I didn't stand. Neither did she. We just sat there in the kind of silence that only exists between two people who despite the odds, feel something forming in the space between them. Eventually, she asked if I needed to charge my phone. I nodded, grateful for an excuse to stay, just a little longer. She disappeared again and came back with an old charger, one of the bulky kinds that barely held together with tape and memory. I thanked her, and she smiled, saying, "Some things still work, even when they look worn out." I wasn't sure if she meant the charger or something else, probably both. I checked the time again and stood up slowly, letting the moment stretch as far as it could go. "Thanks for dinner," I said. She looked at me and said, "Thanks for staying." And then, just before I reached the door, she added, "Come by again, even if it's just for tea." I nodded, not promising anything out loud, but feeling the answer settle somewhere deep, inside me. As I stepped back into the night, the air was cold but no longer biting. I climbed into the van and sat there for a moment before turning the key. In my rearview mirror, her porch light stayed on longer than necessary, and something told me she was still standing at the window, watching to see if I looked back. Did. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a drifter driving away. I felt like someone being invited back. The days that followed felt strangely out of sync with the life I had known. The world kept moving in its usual rhythm. Deliveries to make, traffic lights to obey, polite small talk exchanged with familiar strangers at every stop. But something had shifted in me. Every moment I spent away from her small house, tucked between overgrown hedges and weather-worn fences, felt like filler between two real scenes in a story I didn't yet understand. I told myself it was the meal, the unexpected warmth of it, or maybe just the way she'd listened, genuinely listened, as if my thoughts carried weight. It was rare, the way she looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but directly into whatever I thought I had buried deep beneath years of surface-level living. I didn't rush back to see her, not at first. I wanted to, of course, but something in me held back. I didn't want to seem too eager, didn't want to read more into her invitation than was truly there. But by the third day, when I found myself deliberately rerouting my schedule just to swing by her side of town, I knew it wasn't just curiosity anymore. I was being pulled towards something, or someone. And the feeling was less like falling and more like returning to a place I forgot I had once belonged. When I finally pulled into her driveway again, it was late afternoon, and the sunlight was casting that golden hour glow that made everything look softer, even the edges of the world. She was in the front yard, kneeling by a flower bed, wearing gardening gloves and a faded flannel shirt that had seen better days, but somehow made her look even more graceful. She didn't look up right away. She was focused, tucking a stubborn root back into the soil like it mattered more than the arrival of anyone else. I almost didn't want to interrupt her, but then she spoke without turning. "I was wondering when you'd circle back," she said, and that was all it took for every trace of awkwardness to dissolve. I walked over, crouched beside her, and offered to help. She handed me a trowel, like she'd been saving it for me. No explanations, no pleasantries. Just a silent agreement that I was welcome. We spent an hour in the dirt, mostly quiet, occasionally exchanging observations about the stubbornness of weeds or the unpredictability of weather. When the sun began to dip, she stood and dusted her hands off. "Tea?" she asked, already walking toward the porch. I followed without answering. Inside, it was the same warm chaos I remembered. Books in uneven stacks, a few art prints curling. At the edges, a cat I hadn't noticed before sleeping on the back of the couch. She poured the tea without asking my preference. Somehow, she already knew I'd take it with just a little honey. We sat in the kitchen this time, the air smelling faintly of cinnamon and old wood. I asked her how long she'd lived alone. She stirred her tea and said, "Long enough to stop calling it alone." It wasn't sad the way she said it, just honest, like everything else about her. I told her about my childhood then, something I rarely talked about. The way my parents moved, from state to state chasing jobs that never lasted. The way I learned early not to get attached to neighborhoods, classmates, or even my own bedroom because everything could change with a single U-Haul truck. She listened without pity, without trying to fix it. She just held the space. That was something I hadn't realized I'd been needing until it was right there in front of me. When I asked her about her past, she didn't flinch either. She talked about a marriage that started with love and ended with silence. About raising two kids who were now off in different corners of the country, too busy to visit often but still calling on Sundays if they remembered. About how one day the house got quiet and just stayed that way. You get used to your own company, she said, until one day you realize you'd trade 10 years of peace for 1 week of being seen. There was no music playing, no television, humming in the background, but somehow the room felt full, like something unspoken had pulled up a chair and joined us. I didn't want the evening to end, but the light outside had slipped into that blue hour when shadows stretch long and the world begins to fold itself inward. I stood reluctantly and thanked her again. She walked me to the door, her hand brushing the frame as if grounding herself. Just before I stepped out, she said, "You make the quiet feel less lonely." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. My chest felt tight in the way it does when something old begins to shift. I climbed into the van and sat there, for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in my bones. This wasn't just about tea or kindness anymore. It was something else, something I hadn't named yet but could feel all the same. Driving away that night, the streetlights blurred through the windshield, and I caught myself glancing in the rearview mirror again. Her porch light was still on, same as before. But, this time, I didn't feel like I was leaving anything behind. I felt like I was carrying it with me. The following week unfolded in a rhythm I hadn't known I craved until I was swept into it, slow and steady, like the creak of an old rocking chair on a wooden porch. My deliveries took me all over town. Boxes, bags, sometimes awkward crates that barely fit through narrow doorways, but my mind always drifted back to that house, to her, to the small gestures that had started to tether me more firmly than I cared to admit. It wasn't anything loud or dramatic. There were no declarations, no urgent needs. But it was the little things that stayed with me. The way she smoothed the edge of the tablecloth when she was thinking. The way her voice softened when she talked to the cat, who I'd learned was named Basil and had been with her since the last of her children moved out. The way she paused before every answer, as if words mattered more than most people gave them credit for. I found myself rearranging my delivery routes, building excuses to pass her street at the right time of day. I'd knock on her door with something as simple as a forgotten receipt or an offer to help trim back the ivy growing wild along her gate. And she'd always smile. Not surprised, not overly enthusiastic, just calm and welcoming, like I belonged, there without ever needing to prove it. One afternoon, I arrived to find her sitting on the porch with an old photo album in her lap, sunlight catching the silver in her hair. She motioned for me to join her, and I did, without hesitation. She flipped through the pages slowly, letting me glimpse a past filled with grainy photographs, birthday candles, beach vacations, first days of school. Her kids looked happy, confident. She looked radiant in those early photos, barefoot in the sand, eyes full of a kind of youth that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with possibility. "They used to think I could fix anything," she said, her fingers brushing a picture of a broken tricycle and a proud little boy. A jammed chain, a burnt pancake, a scraped knee. I was magic back then. Her smile didn't falter, but there was a trace of something deeper behind it. Nostalgia, maybe, or a softness that had learned to live with letting go. I told her it wasn't just kids who needed that kind of belief. Sometimes adults did too. She looked at me then. Not through me, not politely, but like she saw something I hadn't even put into words yet. The days started to feel lighter somehow, like the air had changed between us. I still did my rounds, still made deliveries, but they became punctuated by quiet moments in her kitchen, or hands' dirty work in her overgrown backyard. We planted lavender and rosemary in cracked ceramic pots she found buried in the shed. I fixed the hinge on her pantry door that had been groaning for years, and in return, she taught me how to make chicken pot pie from scratch, showing me with patient hands how to crimp the edges just right. There was no talk of us, no labels, or expectations. But the space between us began to hold more meaning, like a room slowly being filled with light through half-drawn curtains. She never asked personal questions unless they rose naturally in conversation. When she did, it never felt invasive. It felt like an invitation, not a requirement. One evening, We sat out back under a sky thick with stars, a breeze threading through the trees and carrying the scent of fresh soil and something simmering from the kitchen. We talked about time, about how quickly it seemed to move when you stopped chasing it, how quietly it could steal moments from under your nose if you weren't paying attention. I told her about the years I'd wasted trying to prove myself to people who were never looking. She nodded, sipping from a mug of tea and letting the silence do its part. "I think we all spend a lot of energy trying to be chosen," she said finally. "Until one day we realize the real gift is in choosing." That sentence clung to me like morning fog, lingering long after the night had passed. The next morning, she called me before I'd even started my route. Her voice was light, cheerful, but there was a tremble beneath it that only someone paying close attention would catch. She asked if I could stop by on my way to the northern edge of town, something about needing help moving a bookcase. I told her I'd be there in 20 minutes. When I arrived, she met me at the door holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing that same worn flannel shirt from our gardening day. "You didn't have to rush," she said, handing me the cup. "I just didn't want to spend the morning alone." I didn't say anything, just followed her inside, and as I stepped into the warm quiet of her home, something in me settled. The bookcase was a pretext. She admitted it later. But I didn't mind. I would have come even if she'd asked me, to fix a curtain rod that didn't exist. We spent the afternoon reordering the living room, shifting furniture that hadn't moved in years. She let me lift the heavy things, but insisted on choosing where everything went. Her logic was occasionally strange, like putting the reading chair near the darkest corner because the lamp deserves more purpose, but I didn't question it. By the time we were done, the room looked no different to an outsider, but to us, it felt transformed, reclaimed. She made soup that night, potato leek, her mother's recipe, and we ate it on the floor, cross-legged like teenagers, laughing, over stories neither of us had ever told before. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door and placed a hand lightly on my arm. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me." I wanted to say something profound in return, something that matched the moment, but all I could do was nod and hold her gaze just long enough for her to know I meant it. The next time I saw her, there was a quiet shift in the air between us. Not an awkwardness, but a kind of recognition that something had taken root and was beginning to grow in the spaces we had been careful not to label. I showed up with 2 bags of groceries that didn't need to be delivered, but gave me an excuse to stop by. She was on the porch again, this time barefoot, a paintbrush in one hand and a tin of light blue paint by her side, slowly reviving an old wooden bench. There was a smear of color on her cheek, and when she saw me, she smiled without surprise, like she'd already counted on me being there. "Just in time," she said, not asking why I'd come or what I was carrying, only moving aside to make room for me to sit. I dropped the bags just inside the door and picked up the second brush, resting on the ground next to her, wordlessly joining her in the task. The sun was warm on our backs and the scent of fresh paint mixed with the lavender we'd planted weeks ago, filling the silence with something soft and unspoken. We didn't need conversation. Our hands spoke as we worked side by side, the rhythm of the strokes settling into something steady and familiar. When we finished, she stepped back, wiping her hands on a cloth and examining the bench with the kind of satisfaction that comes not just from completing a task, but from doing it with someone who made the moment matter. "Not bad," she said, "for a couple of amateurs." I chuckled, brushing a streak of paint off my forearm. "Speak for yourself," I said. "I went to 2 whole semesters of community college art classes." She laughed, a genuine sound that lit up her face. And I realized then how little I'd heard that kind of laughter in my life lately. Not just hers, but mine too. Inside, the house had started to feel like a reflection of our time together. Little signs of care that accumulated slowly but meaningfully. The once neglected bookshelf was now organized with paperbacks and worn cookbooks. The kitchen counters held fresh herbs in mason jars, and even the hallway had a new coat of pale cream paint that made it feel brighter, more open. These weren't dramatic renovations. They were subtle, intentional changes, like the way we were with each other. It was as if the house had taken on the energy of what was building between us. Steady, warm, and growing stronger with every shared morning coffee and every evening spent talking beneath a sky that seemed to stretch wider the longer we stayed. Out there. She told me stories sometimes about her children, scattered now across the country and lives too busy to call more than once or twice a month. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a kind of quiet understanding that time changes. People and distance does its own kind of damage. But as she spoke, I could sense how much she still carried them with her. In the framed photos above the fireplace, in the birthday cards tucked into drawers, in the way she still set an extra plate at dinner out of habit. I never asked about her husband. She never brought him up, and I respected that silence. Some parts of the past are best left to rest in their own quiet corners, and I wasn't there to stir them unless invited. That evening, after we'd eaten a simple dinner of grilled vegetables and leftover stew, we sat out on the porch again, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The bench, now dry, held our weight as if it had always been meant for this moment. The breeze was cool, the kind that carries early hints of fall even in late summer. I noticed the way she pulled her cardigan tighter, the way she leaned slightly in my direction without realizing it, like her body had already decided something her mind hadn't quite caught up to. "Do you ever think," she said suddenly, her voice quiet, "that life gives you a second act when you least expect it?" I turned to look at her, unsure whether she was talking about herself, about us, or about something else entirely. "Sometimes," I said, "but I think it only happens if you're willing to notice it." She nodded slowly, staring out at the tree line. "I wasn't, for a long time," she said. "I was just getting through the days. But then you knocked on my door." The weight of those words sat with me for a moment. Not heavy in a burdensome way, but grounded, like roots digging into soil that had been waiting for them. I wanted to say something back, something real. But all I managed was, "I'm glad I did." As night fell, the porch light flickered on, casting a soft glow around us. The bugs buzzed in the distance, the sounds of the world winding down for the night. She stood first, brushing crumbs from her lap. "You can stay for dessert if you want," she said, and I followed her inside without hesitation. In the kitchen, she pulled a pie from the fridge, homemade, cherry, slightly uneven, around the edges, and cut us each a slice. We ate in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. When I finally rose to leave, she walked me to the door, as always. But this time she lingered. "Before you go," she said, and I turned to face her. "I don't want to make this weird, but you matter to me, more than I expected, more than I probably should admit." I searched her eyes, unsure whether to joke or step back or reach for her hand. But she didn't need a response, she just needed me to hear it. And I did. Every word, every breath between the words. I nodded once, slowly, and she smiled like that was all the answer she needed. The days that followed took on a rhythm that didn't need defining, just a quiet momentum that pulled us both forward without either of us trying to force direction. I kept showing up, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with no excuse at all. And every time she opened the door, it felt a little less like a visit, and a little more like I was simply returning to where I belonged. There was comfort in the repetition of our days. I would help around the property, trimming hedges, fixing the old wooden stairs that had begun to sag, repainting a shutter she hadn't even realized had cracked. And she would work beside me or bring me a glass of iced tea without asking if I wanted one, just assuming correctly that I did. The space between us grew smaller, not just in physical distance but in the way we moved around each other, like two puzzle pieces slowly clicking into place. Conversations happened in fragments, sometimes about nothing: weather, neighbors, the overly friendly cat from down the road who kept sneaking into her backyard, and other times they'd catch us off guard, dipping into vulnerable memories neither of us had intended to share. She told me about the time she almost moved to France in her 20s, how fear and love for a man who didn't deserve it had held her back. I shared how I'd once bought a one-way ticket to Portland and never got on the flight because I realized I didn't know what I was running toward, only what I wanted to leave behind. These exchanges didn't need deep analysis. We let them hang between us, unjudged and understood, like souvenirs from different versions of ourselves. It wasn't just the stories we told each other. It was the silences that followed them. Comfortable, easy silences that filled the room. Like old songs we didn't need to sing aloud anymore. I'd never experienced that before, Not truly. With her, it felt like I could sit still and just exist, without having to perform or explain. The pressure to impress or protect my own image dissolved with every day I spent at that little house with the garden that never quite grew in straight rows, and the wind chimes that played off-key in the breeze. It became our haven. And I say, our, because that's what it began to feel like, even if we hadn't spoken those words aloud. Her kitchen began to smell like my cooking. My boots started to find their home by her door. She kept a jar of my favorite coffee on the shelf, and I replaced a burnt-out light bulb in the hallway without asking. These small acts weren't declarations, but they were undeniable acknowledgments of something real. Something neither of us had planned for, but both had come to lean into. One evening, just as the sky dipped into that rich indigo hue that only lasts for a few minutes between sunset and dusk, we sat outside without saying much, watching the bats start their flight under the rising stars. She had a blanket pulled over her lap, and I sat close enough that the edge of it draped over my knee. She didn't move it, and I didn't mention it. The stillness was perfect, until she said, so softly, I almost missed it, "Do you think it's too late for people like us?" I turned to her, not entirely sure what she meant, but understanding the feeling behind it. People like us. People who had lived long enough to carry regrets, to have watched the years pass in a blur of duty or disappointment, to have missed moments we couldn't get back. People who had stopped believing second chances were for them. I thought about her question for a long second, then answered with a calm certainty I hadn't known I felt until the words left my mouth. No. I think sometimes the best things come after we stop expecting them. She nodded once, looking down at her hands. She didn't respond, but the way she leaned just a little closer told me she'd heard me. And maybe, just maybe, she believed it too. The next morning, I came by earlier than usual. The air still held the cool bite of dawn, and she was on the porch, sipping her first cup of coffee in a robe and mismatched slippers. Her hair was a little messy, and her eyes still carried the weight of sleep. But when she saw me walking up the path, she smiled like I was exactly the thing she needed to see. I raised a hand in greeting, holding up the brown bag I'd picked. Up on the way, 2 fresh croissants, still warm. "Breakfast delivery," I said, and she waved me up without hesitation. We sat in silence for a few moments after I passed her one of the pastries, the morning birds doing most of the talking. Then, without turning her head, she asked, "Do you ever think you were supposed to meet someone earlier, but life made you wait until you were ready?" I considered that. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it just takes time to become the person they'd recognize." She finally looked at me, her expression unreadable for a moment, then softened. "You say things like that and make it really hard not to get attached," she said, almost teasing, but not entirely. I took a sip of coffee and shrugged. "Maybe I want you to." The words hung there, bold and unadorned. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just smiled, shook her head slightly and said, "You're dangerous, you know that?" But her voice wasn't warning. It was wonder. The days had started blending in the way only truly peaceful days can. Not because nothing happened, but because everything felt steady, predictable in the best way. There was no longer a question of whether I'd come by or when I'd leave. It was simply assumed that I was part of her world now, and somehow, the space I occupied in her home felt earned. I'd taken to bringing small things without fanfare, a book I thought she'd like, a new pot holder when I noticed the old one was threadbare, extra bulbs for the lamp that flickered beside her. Couch. She never made a big deal out of it, never overthanked or overreacted, just smiled with this quiet look that made it clear she saw me, really saw me, in ways others never had. She would cook dinner sometimes, but often we'd find ourselves making something together, not even consciously assigning roles. I'd chop, she'd stir. I'd reach for the salt, she'd already have it in hand. And in that silent coordination, there was an intimacy that no words could replicate. Every now and then, I'd catch her watching me, not in the way people watch to study, but in the way someone might look at a song they've loved for a long time and didn't realize was still playing. When I'd meet her gaze, she wouldn't look away. She'd hold it, like she wanted me to know she meant it. And I did. One night, while the air was still warm and the mosquitoes hadn't yet declared war, We decided to eat outside under the string of lights she'd hung years ago but hadn't used since. I fixed the broken switch earlier that afternoon, and now they glowed like soft stars above us, casting our plates and glasses in a romantic hue we both pretended not to notice. The meal was simple: grilled vegetables, some leftover chicken, a salad, but it tasted like something made for a celebration. We clinked glasses of cheap red wine, not offering a toast, but acknowledging that something had shifted. As we ate, the conversation wandered through lightness and laughter, until it settled into something deeper, like it always did with us. She spoke about her younger years with a mix of fondness and fatigue, about the places she almost moved to, the jobs she almost took, the men she almost loved. There was no bitterness in her voice, but there was reflection, the kind that only comes when you've lived long enough to know the weight of what you leave behind. She asked me about regrets then, and I paused. I thought of the times I'd stayed too long where I wasn't wanted, the friendships I let die because I was too proud to say, "I miss you," the way I avoided mirrors for years because I didn't like what they reminded me of, not my face, but the man behind it. I told her some of that, not all of it. Enough. And she listened the way she always did, without interrupting, without rushing, just holding the space like it mattered. When I finished, she reached across the table and touched my hand. Not for long. Just a moment. But with a softness that said more than any words could. I looked at her then, really looked, and in that moment, everything I hadn't been willing to say out loud crystallized. I wanted to stay, not just for dinner, not just for the season. I wanted to be there through the early mornings and the long winters, through the mundane chores and the quiet holidays. I wanted to be the one who remembered how she took her tea and which side of the bed she hated because the window draft always found it. I wanted a future with her. Not because it was thrilling or shiny or new, but because it felt true. Later, after the dishes were done and the wine was gone, we found ourselves on the couch, sharing a blanket, watching a movie neither of us really cared about. The flickering screen lit her profile in soft blues and grays, and for a while, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, almost like she was afraid of the answer, "Do you think this is real?" I turned to her, heart steady, voice certain. "Yes, I do." She nodded slowly, then leaned her head against my shoulder. "I keep waiting for it. To stop feeling this easy," she said. I smiled. Me too. But deep down, I knew that ease didn't come from nowhere. It came from every choice we'd made. To show up, to be kind, to stay honest. It came from effort disguised as instinct, and maybe, just maybe, we'd both earned it. The rhythm of our days became so natural that it stopped feeling like a shift and started feeling like the baseline. I'd still technically deliver groceries, though at that point, the list was more of a formality than a need. Most of the time, she'd walk with me to the truck, leaning on my arm, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. We'd laugh about things we saw at the store, joke about our mismatched playlists that somehow always landed on the same old jazz station, and, without even realizing it, we were stacking memories like bricks. Strong, steady, unshakable. What surprised me most was how comfortable the silence had become. In past relationships, I'd always felt the need to fill space, to keep talking, as if words were the glue holding things together. But with her, the quiet felt full. We could sit at the table, side by side, reading different books or tinkering with projects, not saying a word for an hour, and I'd still feel more connected than I ever had in a room full of conversation. It was the kind of silence that spoke for itself, one that said, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." One particular morning, clouds hung low, casting everything in a silver haze. The kind of day that felt like a pause button on the world. She was in the kitchen, humming while stirring something on the stove, and I was near the window sipping coffee, watching the light filter through the steam. She turned to me suddenly and asked, "Do you think love changes after a certain age?" I considered it. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to answer her the right way. I told her I thought it didn't change as much as it clarified. That maybe, when we're young, we think love is supposed to feel like fireworks, but when we're older, We realize it's more like the warmth of a well-worn coat on a cold morning, comforting, familiar, deeply appreciated. She smiled and said, "That's what I hoped you'd say." And then she turned back to the stove, as if that answer tucked itself quietly into some place inside her that needed reassuring. That evening, after dinner, and a slow walk around the garden where we pointed out the first signs of spring trying to push through the soil, we found ourselves back on that couch, in our now familiar spots. She had her legs tucked under a blanket, and I had my hand resting lightly on her knee. The simple act of contact grounding us both. Out of nowhere, she said, "Do you think people can choose to be each other's home?" It caught me off guard, not because I didn't understand it, but because it felt like something I'd been trying to put into words for weeks. I told her yes, absolutely. That home wasn't a place, it was a presence. Someone who made you feel seen, safe, accepted exactly as you are. Her eyes glistened, just a little, and she whispered, "That's how you make me feel." I didn't answer. I just leaned in and pressed a kiss to her temple, hoping she felt everything I couldn't say out loud yet. As we eased into that night, wrapped in each other's company like it was second nature, I felt something inside me settle. Not in a complacent way, but in a peaceful one. Like I had finally arrived after years of drifting. She told me about her sister that night, the one she hadn't spoken to in almost a decade. The details were delicate, an argument that never quite healed, pride that hardened into distance, but her voice carried more regret than resentment. I asked if she ever thought about calling her. She nodded, then shrugged. "I think about it all the time," she said, "but I keep waiting for the perfect moment. And maybe that's the problem." I didn't push. I just said, "Maybe this is the perfect moment. Or maybe there isn't one. Maybe there's just now." She was quiet for a while, then gave a soft laugh. "You say things that sound simple but land like bricks." I told her that was unintentional, but the truth was, I'd stopped filtering myself around her. For once, I didn't feel like I had to. Later that week, she brought up the idea of a short trip. "Just a couple days," she said. "Somewhere with water, maybe a cabin." I could tell she wanted to test the idea of us in a different space, outside the safety of her home, away from the routines we'd built. I agreed, of course. Not just because I wanted to go, but because I wanted to see how we'd carry ourselves beyond the soft bubble we'd created. Planning it was simple. We both liked quiet over crowds, views over nightlife. But what mattered more than the destination was the way we talked about it. As if it wasn't a vacation, it was a glimpse of something bigger, something shared, something lasting. And as we looked at cabins on her laptop, both of us leaning in, heads nearly touching, I realized that I didn't care where we went. As long as I was next to her, I was already where I wanted to be. The trip came together faster than either of us expected. We found a lakeside cabin just a few hours away, tucked between a patch of evergreens and overlooking a mirror-still body of water that reflected the sky so perfectly it felt like the clouds lived in two places at once. The cabin wasn't luxurious. 2 rooms, a wood-burning stove, and a porch that creaked when you stepped on it. But that was part of the appeal. It felt untouched, like a secret you whisper instead of shout. She packed light, carefully folding, sweaters and slipping in a worn paperback she said she hadn't read in years. I brought the essentials, tools, snacks, and an old deck of cards that had survived more road trips than I could count. As we loaded the car, there was a quiet buzz in the air. Not nervousness, not excitement exactly, but something soft and sacred. Like we were about to step into a version of life we hadn't tested yet, and neither of us wanted to admit how much we hoped it worked. The drive was smooth, the kind where the hum of the tires and the rhythm of passing trees create their own kind of music. We didn't talk the whole way. Sometimes she'd hum along to the radio. Sometimes I'd point out a bird or a cloud formation that caught my eye. But the silence was never heavy. It was a shared quiet, a companionship that didn't demand performance. When we arrived, the cabin welcomed us with a deep stillness. No neighbors, no reception, just the faint smell of pine and the gentle creak of the trees leaning into one another. We unloaded quickly and without much fuss. She set up the kitchen with a little jar of tea bags and the soft click of a stovetop kettle, while I got the fire going and checked that all the windows shut properly. We were a team in the most natural sense, not because we were trying to be, but because it felt instinctive. Like two parts of a machine that had finally found the right gear. That first night, we sat on the porch wrapped in old blankets, sipping tea and watching the sun dissolve behind the trees. The lake shimmered under the fading light, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "If I'd known it could feel like this, I wouldn't have spent so many years chasing the wrong kind of peace." I didn't press her. I didn't ask who or what she meant. I just reached over, letting my fingers find hers beneath the blanket, and gave them a quiet squeeze. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and together we watched the stars come out one by one, each one blinking into place like a soft yes from the sky. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of her flipping pages. She was on the porch again, bundled in a sweatshirt too big for her, one that I hadn't seen in the bag she packed. Her legs were curled under her hair pulled back in a loose knot, and the sun cast a golden halo around her face that made me stop in the doorway for a beat longer than necessary. She looked up and smiled like she'd been waiting for me. "You sleep okay?" she asked. I nodded and sat beside her, letting the mug she offered warm my hands. We didn't do much that day. Walked the trail around the lake, made sandwiches that were too big to finish, played cards until the sun started dipping again. But every second felt intentional. Like we weren't filling time, we were planting it. Each moment was a seed, and the harvest was just being there together, unbothered, unscripted. In the evening, a light rain rolled in, soft at first, then steady enough to send us inside. We lit candles, played music from my phone until the battery gave out, and danced slowly in the living room like people who had no audience and no schedule. Her feet were bare, her eyes half closed, and when she rested her cheek against my chest, I swear the rain outside fell in rhythm with her breathing. It wasn't the kind of night you write songs about because of the drama. It was the kind you remember because it asked for nothing but your presence. Later, lying in bed beside her, I listened to the rain tapping against the roof and thought about how fragile and fierce this kind of intimacy was. Not the kind built on adrenaline or declarations, but the kind you tend to like a garden. Quiet, careful, consistent. She told me a story that night, one about her father teaching her how to drive, how he'd taken her to an empty parking lot, in the middle of a thunderstorm, saying if she could handle driving in that, she could handle anything. "I stalled 3 times, she laughed. "But he never yelled. He just said, 'Start again, you'll get it.'" She turned to me then, voice softer. "I think that's what love is supposed to feel like. Not perfect, just patient." I kissed her then, not because it felt like a moment that needed one, but because my heart wouldn't let me do anything else. She tasted like tea and rain and something I couldn't name but never wanted to forget. As we packed up the car 2 days later, the silence had a different weight. Not sad, but saturated. We weren't mourning the end of the trip. We were preserving it, like tucking a Polaroid into a shoebox, knowing you'll pull it out someday and remember exactly how the air smelled, how her laugh sounded against the lake, how your hand found hers without thinking. On the drive back, she didn't talk much. Neither did I. But her hand never left mine on the console between us. And when we pulled into her driveway and I turned off the ignition, she looked at me with that same question in her eyes I'd seen the first time she asked me to stay for dinner. Only now, it wasn't a test. It was a knowing. And without her saying a word, I answered it by reaching for her hand again, and holding it like I had every intention of never letting go. The days that followed our return from the cabin didn't feel like a come-down, the way good moments sometimes do after they're over. Instead, everything seemed to move with a softer rhythm, like the trip had recalibrated the pace of life itself. She moved through her house with a lightness that hadn't been there before, humming as she folded laundry or watered the plants on her windowsill, and I found myself leaning into the quiet corners of her world more fully. The little things stood out more now, the way she always checked the back door twice before bed, how she tilted her head when reading something that made her think, or how she'd pause mid-sentence to look at me like she was trying to memorize the exact moment. I kept working during the day, taking jobs around the neighborhood, but I always found myself timing my breaks to align with hers. Even the weather seemed to join the rhythm, with gentle winds and golden afternoon light pouring in like the universe had set the dimmer switch just right. She surprised me one evening by asking if I'd come with her to the grocery store. It wasn't a dramatic request, just a casual thing tossed into conversation like it didn't carry any weight. But it did. It meant she wasn't afraid of being seen with me anymore. Not just as the handyman or the guy who fixed her fence, but as someone who belonged next to her. We walked the aisles like we'd done it 100 times, stopping now and then to laugh at the names of odd cereal brands or bicker good-naturedly over which kind of pasta sauce was the right one. A few people nodded at her, one or two even gave me a second glance, but no one said anything. And even if they had, I don't think it would have mattered. Because the way she looked at me when we reached for the same bunch of bananas, like, the moment was bigger than it seemed, was more validating than any label anyone could have given us. Over the next few weeks, something else began to shift. It wasn't spoken, and it wasn't sudden, but it was real. She started making room for me in ways I hadn't expected. A drawer in the hallway suddenly emptied and was offered to me without ceremony. My favorite coffee started appearing in her cupboard without me having to mention it. A key to the house was quietly placed on the hook by the door, nestled between hers. These weren't grand gestures. They were invitations, silent acknowledgments that this wasn't temporary anymore, that I wasn't just a visitor in her life, but a character she was writing into every chapter going forward. And I responded in kind. I showed up more, not just physically but emotionally. I shared more of my past, even the uncomfortable parts. I told her about the time I failed my first carpentry certification, how I used to worry I'd never be enough for anyone because my life didn't come with a corner office or a polished resume. She listened, always, without trying to fix or soften anything. She just made space, and that space made me brave. One evening, she asked if I'd help her go through a box of old letters. They'd been sitting in her closet for years, she said, gathering dust and taking up emotional real estate. We sat cross-legged on the living room floor, papers spread out like a soft chaos between us. Some were from her sister, others from friends she'd lost touch with, but a few were from a man I hadn't heard about before. His name was scrawled across envelope after envelope in a familiar loop. Someone she'd loved once, deeply. She read them slowly, carefully, like each one was a bone she had to handle without breaking. And I didn't interrupt. I didn't let jealousy creep in, didn't let the shadow of the past eclipse the now. Because I knew something that letters couldn't change. I was here. I was the one sitting beside her now, offering a warm hand when she set down the last one with a sigh that sounded like letting go. Later that night, she said, "I'm not afraid of the past anymore." It was a simple sentence, but it landed, heavy in the best way. She leaned into me, her head resting just beneath my chin, and I wrapped my arms around her like I was holding a future I didn't want to drop. That night, I didn't leave. I stayed until morning, and when the sun filtered in through the curtains, painting her skin gold, I realized something I hadn't said out loud yet. I was in love with her. Not in the abstract or hypothetical sense, but in the real, quiet, steady way that builds over shared meals and late-night stories and the silence between heartbeats. And I think she knew. Because when she looked at me, her eyes didn't ask questions. They answered them. I didn't need a dramatic confession. I just needed this. The comfort of her hand finding mine in the sheets and staying there, without fear, without doubt. The days that followed blended into something neither of us tried to name. A gentle rhythm that settled over everything like a soft blanket. It wasn't perfect. Life never is. But it was steady. And in its steadiness, I found something I'd never realized I'd been looking for. She stopped calling me the handyman, even as a joke, and I stopped pretending like I was still just there to fix things. We weren't in some cinematic montage of romance, but we were building something, brick by brick, moment by moment, and every quiet touch, every shared breakfast, every lingering look across the room added to the foundation. She let me leave my tool bag by the door now, as if both of us had silently agreed it wasn't going anywhere. Even the dogs seemed to adjust, lounging by my feet like I belonged as much as the furniture or the old quilt she kept on the couch. Sometimes we wouldn't talk for hours. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything already felt said. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full, like a shared language that didn't need words anymore. One afternoon, we drove out to the coast. She said she hadn't been in years, that the sea always felt like a reset button she never had time to press. We packed sandwiches and old thermoses and drove with the windows down, letting the wind mess with our hair and our thoughts. When we arrived, she took off her shoes and walked barefoot across the sand like it was holy ground. I followed, slower, watching the way her toes curled into the earth like she was grounding herself after a storm. We sat on a worn-out blanket for hours, letting the waves speak for us. At one point, she leaned into me, chin resting on my shoulder, and whispered, "I didn't know it could still feel like this." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. The context was written in the crow's feet around her eyes, in the way she exhaled like she hadn't breathed in years. She wasn't talking about the ocean. She was talking about peace. That night, back at her place, we didn't say much. The drive home was quiet, comfortable. She made tea, I lit the fireplace, and we curled up together like we'd been doing it for decades. I noticed how she traced circles on the back of my hand while we watched the flames dance. That small gesture told me more than any speech ever could. It said she trusted me. It said she was glad I stayed. It said I was hers, not in the possessive way, but in the way that meant I had a place in her story, not just a page. And somewhere between the quiet sips of chamomile and the creak of the floorboards beneath our feet, I knew I didn't want to go back to my place anymore. Not because mine wasn't comfortable, but because hers had become home. Her kitchen, with its mismatched mugs and notes stuck to the fridge. Her garden, where the tomatoes never quite ripened, but she loved them. Anyway, her hallway mirror, where I'd catch her checking her reflection like she wasn't sure she still deserved to be seen. All of it was hers, but she was sharing it with me. And that changed everything. The next morning, I offered to repaint the shutters outside. They weren't in bad shape, but they could use freshening up. She tried to argue at first, said they weren't urgent, but I could tell she liked the idea. Not just because of the paint job, but because of what it represented. That this wasn't temporary, that we were still fixing things, just together now. As I scraped off the old layers of peeling green, she brought out lemonade and sat nearby, reading out loud from a book she loved when she was younger. Her voice was smooth, paced like a heartbeat, and every now and then, she'd pause to ask me what I thought about a line or a character's decision. I didn't always have a clever answer, but she didn't seem to mind. It was less about the words and more about the shared moment, the presence, the subtle weaving of our lives into the same thread. Later, when the shutters were drying and her book was closed, we stood back and admired the simple change. "It looks like new," she said, smiling. "Almost," I replied. "Still yours, just better." But it wasn't all sunshine and metaphorical shutters. One evening, she came into the living room with tears in her eyes and an envelope in her hand. It was from her ex-husband, someone I didn't know much about beyond the quiet bitterness in her voice when his name came up. Apparently, he'd sent a letter, a real one, not an email or a text, saying he was moving to the area and wanted to catch up, as if the years hadn't happened, as if the bruises he never left on her skin didn't leave any on her spirit. She didn't ask me what to do. She just held out the envelope and said, "I want to burn it." I nodded. We went out to the fire pit, lit a match, and watched the paper curl into ash together. She didn't cry as it burned. She didn't curse or shout. She just stared until it was gone, and then looked at me like I was the answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. That night I held her closer than usual, and when she finally fell asleep, I stayed awake a while longer, making silent promises to a sleeping woman who didn't need rescuing, but who deserved protection, all the same. As the seasons started to shift, so did we. Fall came with cooler evenings, and she started wearing those oversized sweaters that made her look even smaller somehow. We spent more time inside, cooking together, binge-watching shows she'd already seen but wanted me to experience. She told me stories about her childhood, about the time she fell out of a tree trying to impress a boy, or how she used to dream of being a veterinarian until she realized she fainted at the sight of blood. I told her about my grandfather's farm, about the summers I spent chasing chickens and painting barns, and about how I'd once built a bookshelf that collapsed under its own weight because I hadn't accounted for the spacing. We laughed more. We fought sometimes too, but it was never cruel. Always about small things. What to make for dinner, which bills were due, whether the thermostat should be set higher or lower. And every disagreement ended the same way, with a quiet apology, a shared smile, and usually a cup of tea passed like a peace offering. There was a shift in the air that didn't quite come from the changing weather. It was something unspoken between us. An awareness that whatever this was between her and me had long since crossed the line from casual comfort to something deeper. It didn't happen with a dramatic confession or a single defining kiss. It was the accumulation of the quiet things. The way her eyes searched for mine when she said something she wasn't sure about. The way my fingers automatically reached for her hand during silence, not needing a reason. We were past the question of what are we and living in the answer, even if we hadn't said it out loud yet. One morning she left a small basket of folded laundry on my side of the bed. It was the first time she'd done that, and though it was subtle, it hit me like a lightning bolt. Because that's how real intimacy creeps up. Not with fireworks, but with baskets of socks and shirts that suddenly mean you belong. I didn't say anything. I just smiled to myself, quietly folding each piece as if it were sacred. That afternoon, I found myself walking the property line, checking the edges of the fence I'd once repaired. I realized I wasn't just inspecting her home anymore. I was walking what felt like mine. Not by deed or contract, but by every sunrise we'd made coffee together, and every midnight we'd fallen asleep with our feet tangled. The wind rustled through the trees, and I remember thinking how strange it was that love, when it's healthy, doesn't feel like a rush. It feels like exhaling after holding your breath for years. I spotted her sitting on the old bench under the oak tree, reading with her feet curled beneath her. She had that look on her face, half focused, half dreaming, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not fixing things, not running, not proving anything, just being there. With her. That night, we had a minor argument. Something about the way I organized the kitchen drawers after doing the dishes. She liked the forks in the far right slot, and I'd mixed them up with the knives. It was so small it was laughable, but for some reason, her tone got sharp, and mine rose right back. It was the first time I saw her go quiet in that way that says, I'm hurt, but don't want to make this worse. And I hated it. Not the argument, those are inevitable, but that brief flicker of distance it created. After a few minutes of tense silence, I walked into the living room where she sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded, her gaze locked on the floor. I sat next to her without saying a word, reached over and gently pulled her hand into mine. I don't care where the forks go, I said. She let out a small breath that might have been a laugh, or maybe just a release of tension. I know, she whispered. I just panicked. It felt like you were changing something that's always been mine. I nodded. Maybe I am, but only because I want to be part of it. Not take it over. She leaned into me after that, her head resting on my shoulder, and for the next hour, we didn't talk about cutlery or territory or how silly the whole thing was. We just let the closeness speak for us. Time moved forward in that way it does, when you're happy. Not in big leaps, but in steady, golden inches. The days didn't blur, but they didn't drag either. I began working fewer outside jobs, taking on only the ones I could do quickly or remotely. More and more, I realized, I didn't want to be gone long. The idea of her waiting at home, of our dinners and our walks, of her humming while she watered the plants, had become more compelling than any paycheck. We cooked new recipes, some of which turned out awful and left us laughing over takeout menus. We painted one of the guest rooms together, and ended up with more blue on our clothes than on the walls. We argued once about whether or not to get a cat. She was for it, I was against. So we compromised, and got a cat. Named it Mischief. It scratched up my work boots, and immediately took to sleeping on my pillow, as if staking its claim. I hated how much I liked the little monster. Then came the evening that changed everything. Not with drama, but with a single sentence. We were out on the porch, wrapped in the same old blanket, her head resting on my chest as the crickets chirped and the moonlight filtered through the trees. Out of nowhere, she said, "Do you think we'll ever leave here?" I asked what she meant. She shrugged. "This house, this version of us, is this it?" I thought about it for a moment, then said the only thing that felt true. "If we never left, I'd be okay with that." She didn't say anything for a while, and then she whispered, "Me too." It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a vow. But it was the closest either of us had come to admitting that we'd built something permanent. That this life we'd fallen into, brick by tender brick, wasn't something we needed to question anymore. In the weeks that followed, our routines deepened into rituals. She planted new flowers along the front walkway and labeled them all with little signs like a museum of growth. I fixed up the old swing in the backyard and oiled the hinges so it sang instead of squeaked. We hosted her sister one weekend, and I watched her introduce me as the man who stayed, and that alone nearly brought me to tears. Not because of pride, but because of what it meant to her to say it. Because of what it had cost her to trust again, and maybe what it had cost me to open my own heart enough to be worthy of it. There was something sacred about the slowness that had settled into our life, an unspoken rhythm that didn't need to be explained or even acknowledged. Mornings began, with the sound of the kettle whistling and the clink of mismatched mugs being pulled from the cupboard, the smell of toasted bread mixing with the scent of her favorite rosehip tea. She'd hum absent-mindedly as she moved through the kitchen, sometimes barefoot, sometimes still wrapped in the robe she swore she'd replace but never did. I'd watch her from the porch, sipping my coffee with the dogs curled at my feet, and think, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a simple, grounded truth. This is home. Not the building or the land, not the chores or the routine, but her. Her presence was the thread stitching all of this together, and even in silence, it echoed louder than any words. We no longer needed to fill every moment with chatter. Some mornings passed with just a nod and a shared smile, and yet I never felt closer to anyone in my life. What we had didn't need performance, it just needed space to breathe. And we gave it that, without ever needing to talk about it. On one particularly warm afternoon, we drove into town together to get supplies. Nothing fancy, just the kind of run that required a hardware store stop and a few essentials from the market. She sat in the passenger seat, window cracked, one foot propped on the dash, hair tied back in a loose braid that kept falling over her shoulder. She was reading off a list, not of things we needed, but of things we might want. A new pair of garden gloves, a stronger hose, cinnamon sticks, not powder, because she'd been craving the smell of something baked. It wasn't what she said, but how she said it. Like every suggestion was an invitation to build something together, however small. At the store, I noticed how she always took a little longer to choose things than I did. She'd read every label, inspect every item like it mattered, like it deserved her full attention. I used to think it was indecision, but I'd come to realize it was care. She paid attention to the details most people skimmed past, and that included people. That afternoon, we bumped into an old friend of hers, someone who hadn't seen her in years. They exchanged pleasantries, a few surprised laughs, and then came the inevitable question. "And who's this?" she asked, gesturing to me. There was a small pause. Not long, but just long enough for me to wonder how she'd introduce me. "This," she said with a soft but certain smile, "is my partner." It landed differently than boyfriend or companion, or even the guy helping with the house. It had weight, solidity, a kind of quiet claim that neither of us had needed until now. I didn't say anything in the moment, but later, when we were driving back and the wind was flicking through her hair, I reached over and squeezed her hand. She didn't need to ask why. Over the following days, we returned to the rhythm of our lives, but something had shifted. Not dramatically, not like an earthquake. More like the gentle tilt of light at the start of a new season. I found myself lingering in rooms she was in, even if I wasn't doing anything. She'd place her hand on the small of my back as she passed me in the kitchen, a touch so brief it could have been accidental, but always intentional. We moved around each other with a kind of mutual choreography that doesn't happen overnight. It's learned, felt, adjusted in real time. One night, we both ended up outside on the porch around midnight. The sky was clear, stars visible like grains of salt scattered across black velvet. Neither of us could sleep. She wrapped herself in a blanket, curled up on the bench beside me, and said, "Do you think we're meant to keep building? Or is this enough?" I didn't answer right away because I didn't want to give her something vague. Eventually, I said, "I think what we're building isn't made of wood or paint or the house itself. It's made of these nights, these questions, the way you look at me when you don't know if I'll understand, and the relief when I do." She didn't reply, but she didn't need to. The silence that followed was full, not of tension, but of understanding. She rested her head on my shoulder, and I let mine rest against hers. There, in the dark, we found another layer of home. It wasn't perfect. There were days we both felt off and didn't know why. Times when I'd want space and she'd want connection, and we had to navigate the gaps between those needs without turning them into arguments. But that's what made it real. It wasn't polished or posed for pictures. It was messy, human, and honest. One evening, she burned the dinner trying to multitask 3 different things. She was frustrated, cursing under her breath, waving smoke out of the kitchen. I walked in, saw the chaos, and without saying a word, opened the fridge and pulled out sandwich fixings. She watched me for a moment, then laughed, covering her face with her hands. "I tried so hard," she said. I slid a plate toward her and replied, "Trying is everything." That night, with sandwiches and sparkling water, we had one of the best dinners of our lives. The late summer air had started to shift just slightly, cooling enough in the evenings that the open windows no longer invited in warmth, but a softness that encouraged blankets and quiet. We hadn't spoken much about the future lately, not because we were avoiding it, but because the present felt so full of tasks, of closeness, of the comfortable space we'd created around each other like a second skin. I'd gotten into the habit of leaving small notes on the fridge. Not for anything grand, just things like, "Don't forget the basil," or "You looked beautiful this morning." She never mentioned them, never made a show of it. But I'd often find one of her scarves left neatly folded by my tools, or a cinnamon muffin wrapped in a napkin beside my coffee mug. These exchanges became their own language. It wasn't always about love in the way books or movies try to sell it. It was about effort, about rhythm, about the kind of attention that takes weeks to form and months to deepen. She started telling me about her dreams again. Real ones. The kinds she'd abandoned quietly when life pressed in too hard. She talked about running workshops for women her age who wanted to learn how to grow their own food or repair things around the house without waiting on someone else. "Not because I don't want help," she said one morning, watching the dogs tumble through the garden, "but because it's good to know you can do things yourself, even if you don't have to." That distinction sat with me longer than I expected. She wasn't someone who needed saving. She was someone who had just needed space to remember she didn't need to disappear in the service of someone else's life. We started taking drives to nowhere in particular. No plans, no destinations. Just long, slow meanders through winding back roads, fields stretching on either side of us, the radio playing whatever local station happened to be in range. Sometimes we'd talk, other times we didn't. But there was never a moment where I wished we were somewhere else. One afternoon, she pointed out an old, abandoned farmhouse set back from the road. Paint peeling, shingles half fallen, porch swallowed by weeds. "That was my uncle's place," she said. "He used to tell me stories about a chest full of gold buried in the cellar. I never found it, but I did find a box of old comic books under a floorboard." She smiled like the memory had just knocked on the back door of her mind. I used to think that was treasure enough. I remember glancing at her as she said it, thinking that maybe real treasure wasn't something you could lock away or bury, or dig up later. Maybe it was just sitting beside someone who knew how to find meaning in even the smallest corners of the past. That evening, we got caught in the rain. We'd left the house for a short walk and ignored the dark clouds gathering at the edge of the sky, convinced they'd pass. They didn't. We were halfway down the gravel path near the fence line when the first drops hit, and before we could turn around, it was coming down hard, sideways, warm, relentless. She shrieked, laughing, hands in the air, spinning in place, like a child who'd never been told to come inside. I stood still, just watching her, hair soaked, shirt clinging to her shoulders. And for a moment, the world got quiet again. Not literally. The rain was loud, drumming on leaves, on rooftops, on the road. But something inside me settled. It was like I finally understood what it meant to be in the right place, at the right time, with the right person. When we got back inside, dripping and breathless, she handed me a towel and said, "You didn't even run." I just shook my head. Didn't want to miss it. Later that week, she invited a couple of her oldest friends over for dinner. She hadn't hosted in years, not since her previous life, the one filled with obligations that drained more than they gave. I helped in the kitchen while she moved around with purpose, a quiet pride glowing behind every action. The table was simple: roast chicken, garden vegetables, wine, and a pie she'd made from scratch. Her friends were warm, curious, clearly surprised to see her looking so alive. They asked questions, teased her gently, and threw side glances at me whenever she laughed a little too loud or touched my arm without realizing it. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman named Maeve, pulled me aside while the others were in the living room. "You're good for her," she said, voice low but steady. "But don't mistake her softness for fragility. She survived more than most people know. Don't be the reason she builds another wall." I nodded, grateful for the honesty. "I'd rather be the reason she never has to." Maeve studied me a moment longer, then gave a single approving nod. Good answer. That night, when the dishes were done and her friends had left, she stood at the sink, hands in the soapy water, staring out the window. I walked up behind her, wrapped my arms around her waist, and rested my chin on her shoulder. "You okay?" She nodded. It felt normal again, like the old parts of my life and the new ones don't have to fight each other anymore. I didn't say anything. I just held her, because there's a difference between fixing someone and witnessing their healing. One is about control. The other is about presence. And I knew now which one we had chosen. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Less about any single moment, and more about the quiet consistency that began to stitch itself between us like invisible thread. I'd wake up earlier now, not because I had to, but because I wanted to catch the light just as it started pouring through her kitchen window. Golden and slow. The kind that made everything feel like it was on pause. She'd shuffle in moments. Later, hair pulled back loosely, wearing the same robe I'd seen a dozen times, and yet somehow it felt like the first. There was a stillness in those mornings that no noise could disturb, a rhythm in our movement around the space that didn't need words. The toast would pop, the kettle would hiss, the newspaper would be folded once, then twice, and without trying, we had become a kind of dance. I noticed the way she hummed when she stirred cream into her coffee. She noticed how I always wiped the counter twice, even if it was already clean. These weren't habits anymore. They were signals, little reassurances that said, "I see you. I'm here. You matter." One afternoon, I caught her sorting through an old box in the attic, the air thick with dust and memory. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by yellowed photographs, handwritten letters, and keepsakes that hadn't seen light in years. I didn't ask questions at first. I just sat nearby, offering quiet company. But after a while, she looked up at me with a half-smile and said, "Do you ever wonder if you lived someone else's life before this one?" I knew what she meant. Not in the reincarnation sense, but in the way people sometimes bury their old selves to survive. She handed me a photo. Her, maybe 30, standing on a beach I didn't recognize, laughing with someone cropped just out of frame. "I think I used to be fun," she said. I shook my head gently. "You still are. You just stopped having people who remembered how to laugh with you." That answer must have landed somewhere deep, because she didn't speak after that. She just leaned her head on my shoulder and let the silence hold us both. As the days turned cooler and the garden began to fade, she started pulling things out of the ground with a sort of reverence. Carrots, beets, a few stubborn tomatoes still clinging to life. She'd wash them carefully, trim the ends, set them on the counter like little trophies. "Funny how something can grow in the same soil you once thought was useless," she said once, running her fingers through the dirt. I knew she wasn't talking about vegetables. In the evenings we started playing records, Actual vinyl, scratched, and warbling, on the old player she'd kept stashed behind a cabinet. The music was soft, imperfect, warm. Sometimes we danced. Other times we just sat on the couch, our legs tangled, the dogs curled at our feet, listening to the crackle of something that had outlived its time and was still somehow beautiful. Morning, I came inside after splitting wood and found her sitting at the table with a piece of paper in front of her, fingers tapping nervously against the edge. She looked up, eyes wide with the kind of vulnerability that makes you sit down before you even speak. "I've been thinking about selling the house," she said. Not out of restlessness or regret, but with a kind of quiet resolution. Not because I don't love it, but because maybe it's time to choose something for the future, not the past. The idea shook me. This house had become the backdrop of everything we were building. But I understood. Sometimes, starting over means letting go of even the safest places. "Where would you go?" I asked. She shrugged. "Somewhere with a little land, enough for a garden, a smaller kitchen, less roof to fix." She looked at me. "Would you come with me?" And just like that, a question that once might have scared me now felt like a promise. "Yeah," I said. "I would." That evening, we sat outside wrapped in a shared blanket, a thermos of cider between us. The stars were beginning to cut through the sky, sharp and silver. "Do you ever feel like we're stealing time?" she asked. I thought about it. "No," I said finally. "I think we're finally using it right." She leaned into me, her breath warm against my collar. "You know, I used to think I missed my chance." I turned to her. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I know chances don't disappear, they just wait until you're ready." It was strange how fast something could start to feel like home. Not just the house, though the chipped tile and old window frames had a charm of their own, but the space between us, the moments suspended in quiet comfort, the way our routines had woven together like thread through cloth. I wasn't keeping track of time anymore, not in the way I used to. Days didn't feel like obligations now, but invitations. I'd wake up before the alarm, open the curtains to let the morning light spill across her kitchen floor, and there she'd be, standing barefoot at the stove like she belonged to the moment completely. She didn't rush through things the way I did when I was younger. She took her time with everything, chopping vegetables like it was an art, folding laundry like it had meaning, even sipping coffee like it was a conversation. I started to mirror that rhythm. I didn't realize it until I caught myself staring out the window for no reason one afternoon. Just watching the breeze flicker through the trees. I wasn't waiting for anything. I was just there. Fully. Finally. We started spending more time outside. She loved the garden, even in its off-season state. Dead stalks, fallen leaves, soil still clinging to the promise of spring. There was a peace to tending to something that wasn't asking for anything but patience. We'd rake the last of the leaves into slow, deliberate piles, talking about nothing and everything. She told me stories I'd never heard before, about a road trip she took in her 20s with a friend who disappeared from her life shortly after, about a poem she wrote once and never showed anyone, about a cat she rescued during a thunderstorm and kept for 12 years. None of it was meant to impress me, but all of it did. There was a softness to her voice when she told these stories, like they were pieces of herself she hadn't shared in a long time. Maybe not with anyone. And I didn't just listen. I memorized. Every inflection, every pause, every glance at the sky like she was remembering something bigger than what the words could carry. One evening, we were organizing the attic, sorting through boxes that hadn't been touched in decades. Most of it was junk. Old curtains, cracked Christmas ornaments, a blender that probably hadn't worked since the 90s. But then we found the box of letters. It was duct-taped at the corners, covered in dust, and when she opened it, her hands trembled just slightly. Inside were stacks of handwritten pages, letters she'd written to her younger self but never sent. She picked one up, scanned it quickly, then handed it to me. "You should read it," she said. "I don't think I can." I took it, unsure if I should read aloud or not, but the decision was made for me as I noticed her walking away toward the small attic window, arms crossed like she was bracing for impact. The letter was short, but heavy. It was from a version of her that was still trying to believe she was worth something. A girl who had been hurt, left, underestimated, and who was trying desperately to speak strength into her future. I read it quietly, each sentence more intimate than the last, and when I finished, I folded it gently and set it back into the box. I didn't say anything. I just walked over and stood beside her, offering the kind of silence that says, I get it. That night, she didn't want to talk much. She just curled into me on the couch, head on my chest, the television playing something neither of us was really watching. That was enough. As winter crept in, the days grew shorter, and our routines shifted again. There was more cooking, more tea, more moments spent sitting close to stay warm. She started knitting again, something she said she hadn't done in years. I started helping her plan small house repairs, not because they needed doing urgently, but because it gave us projects to do together. Tiny goals, stitched into the fabric of our weeks. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't romantic in the movie sense. But it was real. There was a night in December when the power went out unexpectedly, and we lit candles around the living room. She pulled out an old photo album and we sat cross-legged on the floor like kids, flipping through pages that smelled faintly of time. Some pictures made her laugh out loud. Others made her go quiet. She showed me one of herself at 20, standing in front of a beat-up VW van with a grin that could have lit the street. That version of me thought she'd change the world, she said. Maybe she did, I replied. She looked at me, unsure whether to believe that or not. But I meant it. We had our first argument not long after that. It wasn't explosive, just sharp around the edges. A misunderstanding about something small. Plans we miscommunicated. Emotions that bubbled up from elsewhere. For a moment, I thought she might retreat, pull away like people do when they've been alone too long and aren't used to compromise. But she didn't. She sat on the couch, arms folded, face tense, and when I offered an apology, not to fix it quickly, but to own my part, she softened. I'm not good at this, she admitted. Neither am I said. We didn't resolve it with a dramatic speech or a kiss. We resolved it by staying in the room, by refusing to walk away from something just because it got uncomfortable. Later that night, she reached for my hand under the blanket and held it. We'll figure it out, she whispered. And that was enough. Sometimes I'd find myself staring at her when she wasn't looking, while she hummed to herself in the kitchen, or when she read on the porch with her feet tucked under a blanket. There was a gravity to her now, not like someone holding everything together, but like someone who had finally stopped running. She wasn't perfect, and she never pretended to be. But she was honest. And that, I realized, was rarer than I'd ever admitted. One night, as we stood outside to catch the last snowflakes falling like feathers in the dark, she said, You know, I used to think no one would ever stay. I didn't answer with a speech or a vow. I just wrapped my arms around her and whispered, I'm not going anywhere. And in that stillness, I felt something shift, not just in her, but in me. We weren't saving each other. We were simply choosing each other, again and again. And that made all the difference. The first true blizzard of the season arrived in the early hours of a Wednesday morning, slipping in under cover of darkness and blanketing the world with a thick coat of white before anyone had time to prepare. I woke to the quiet, an eerie, almost sacred silence that only snow can bring, broken only by the occasional crack of shifting branches or the creak of the old roof under the weight of winter. From the bedroom window, I watched the world disappear into a dreamlike haze. Everything was muted, soft, and impossibly still. The roads were gone, the fences buried, and the trees bowed like they were making peace with the storm. It was beautiful, in that humbling way nature sometimes reminds you that you're just a visitor here. When I stepped into the kitchen, she was already there, wrapped in her thickest sweater, fingers cradling a steaming mug of tea, her breath clouding faintly in the chill. The power had gone out sometime in the night, and we both knew without saying it, this wasn't going to be fixed in a few hours, maybe not even a day. But there was no panic in her expression, just calm readiness, like a woman who had met storms before and learned how to dance with them. We moved instinctively, without needing to discuss much. She pulled extra blankets from the hallway closet. I gathered wood from the covered pile on the porch. The fireplace roared to life under my hands, its warmth quickly chasing the cold from the living room. She lit candles and placed them carefully around the space, each tiny flame a soft heartbeat in the shadows. We rearranged the furniture a bit to conserve heat, pulling the couch closer to the hearth and layering pillows like fortresses. There was something strangely exciting about it all, like we'd been transported back in time, cut off from the world but entirely self-reliant. As the snow piled higher outside, we settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like sacred retreat. She made oatmeal over the fire in a cast-iron pot so old it looked like it belonged in a museum. And we ate from mismatched bowls, laughing at how smoky the flavor turned out to be. I teased her for burning it. She teased me for chopping wood like I was auditioning for a lumberjack calendar. And through it all, the dogs lay nearby, their breathing slow, their bodies curled close to the heat, as if they too knew this was exactly where they were meant to be. By mid-afternoon, the house had become our world. The storm raged on, wind howling, like an ancient voice. But inside, everything felt safe, insulated, tucked away. She read to me from an old book she found buried in the bottom of a storage bin, some forgotten novel with yellowed pages and a brittle spine. And even though the story was half boring and the plot made little sense, I loved the sound of her voice rising and falling with each line. I watched her as she read, the way her eyebrows danced with the characters, the way she occasionally paused to laugh at her own delivery. There was a light in her that the storm outside couldn't touch, a softness that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with presence, with peace. As she read, I thought about all the versions of myself that had come before. The younger man who rushed through everything, the one who thought love had to be loud and dramatic to be real. But this quiet, ordinary, extraordinary afternoon beside a woman who asked for nothing and gave everything without realizing it. This was what I'd been searching for without knowing it. That night, the temperature dropped even further, and we bundled ourselves into thick socks and layers of sweaters before curling up under a mountain of blankets on the couch. The fire cracked and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She laid her head on my chest, fingers absent-mindedly tracing small circles on my arm, and I could feel her breath steady and warm against me. We didn't speak for a long time. We didn't need to. In that silence, I found answers to questions I hadn't even asked yet. That this was real. That this connection wasn't built on grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but on small decisions, moment by moment, to show up for each other, to stay. At some point she murmured, "I never thought I'd get to have this again." I didn't respond with words. I just pulled her closer, because I knew exactly what she meant. I never thought I'd have this either. Not at this point. In life. Not after all the disappointments. Not after all the ways we learn to guard our hearts as we age. But here we were, against all odds, surviving a storm in more ways than one. By the following morning, the worst of it had passed. The snow was still deep, but the skies had cleared, and light poured through the windows like a quiet victory. I went out with a shovel to dig a path from the porch to the mailbox, the effort both exhausting and oddly satisfying. She watched from inside, sipping coffee and smiling like I was some kind of folk hero. When I came back in, cheeks red and hands frozen, she wrapped a scarf around my neck and kissed my forehead without thinking about it, like it was the most natural thing in the world. That kiss didn't come with fanfare, no sweeping score. Just lips against skin, warmth against cold, a promise sealed in simplicity. And I just knew, that whatever came next, whatever storms or seasons, I didn't want to face them, anywhere else but here, with her. We spent the rest of that day slowly resetting the house, bringing things back to their usual places, laughing as we found socks in weird corners, or realized we'd eaten all the marshmallows during our snowbound movie marathon. Everything returned to normal, and yet, nothing was quite the same. That storm had changed something, not in a dramatic way, but in the way it revealed what mattered, how easily we adapted, how deeply we trusted each other to handle the chaos. That kind of resilience wasn't flashy, but it was rare. and it made me realize I wasn't just building a life with her. I was learning how to live a life worth staying for. That evening, she hung a little ceramic bell by the front door, one she'd had for years but never found a spot for. When I asked her what it was for, she said, "It's a reminder. That piece takes work, but it's worth it." I nodded, because I understood. And later that night, as I drifted to sleep with her beside me, I thought about how strange it was that a grocery delivery, just one simple errand, had led me here. To a storm, to a couch full of blankets, to a woman who saw me, held space for me, and taught me, without trying, that staying is the most powerful thing a person can do. The days after the storm melted into a kind of rhythm that felt almost sacred. It wasn't that life became easy or perfect. Far from it. The driveway still needed plowing. The generator occasionally stuttered with a temperamental hum, and the groceries we had left were growing more creative by the meal. But somehow, all of it became part of a flow that neither of us wanted to disturb. We learned each other's silences more deeply, recognized the difference between quiet that meant peace and quiet that meant something was stirring underneath. She had a way of glancing out the window with her fingers tucked under her chin whenever something was bothering her, and I had a habit of stepping outside and pretending to check on things when I needed a moment to think. We never called each other out for these escapes. We just made space for them. And maybe that was the most adult thing I'd ever experienced in a relationship. This mutual understanding that some things don't need to be solved right away. They just need room to breathe. There was one afternoon, a few days after the blizzard, where I found her in the garage, going through a box of old photos. Not the kind you post on social media, but real ones, glossy prints with curled edges and fading colors. I sat down beside her on the floor, knees creaking like the old beams above us, and we slowly leafed through decades of someone else's world. Her world. There was a picture of her as a young woman in a leather jacket and ripped jeans, standing beside a motorcycle with a grin that didn't know fear yet. Another of her holding a baby, arms wrapped tightly, smile softer, eyes older. I didn't ask about the man missing from those frames. I didn't need to. Some stories don't require retelling. They live in the pauses, in the way her fingers lingered a moment longer on certain images, or the way she exhaled like a wave was passing through her. When she finally spoke, it was with a tone that carried both weight and grace. "I used to think memories were meant to be protected like relics," she said, almost to herself. "But now I think they're just meant to be felt, then let go." I nodded, unsure whether to reply or just listen. So I listened. Later that week, we tackled a few projects around the house. Not because they had to be done, but because shared work has a way of deepening connection. We replaced the squeaky hinges on the back door, reorganized the pantry, and even painted the small spare room she'd always meant to turn into an art space. She said she hadn't picked up a brush in years, claimed she'd forgotten how, but the way she handled color made me think otherwise. Watching her paint was like watching someone return to a language they thought they'd forgotten. Clumsy at first, then fluent, almost lyrical. I never asked her what she was painting. I just watched, quietly admiring how focused she became, how still her breathing turned as the strokes fell into place. She made it look effortless, even though I knew it wasn't. Just like everything else about her. Simple on the surface, layered like the woods outside this house once you stepped in deeper. One night, after we'd finished another puzzle and laughed too hard over a broken corkscrew, we found ourselves lying on the floor beside the fire, heads resting on folded blankets, the warmth lulling us into a kind of honesty that only arrives when the world feels perfectly paused. She turned to me then, eyes catching the flames flicker, and asked something I didn't expect. "Do you think we're just borrowing time?" I blinked, unsure where she was going. "What do you mean?" She shrugged slightly, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "I mean, people like us, meeting this late, with lives behind us already written. Maybe this isn't forever. Maybe it's just a season." I wanted to answer quickly, to reassure her, to say that love doesn't come with timestamps, but something in her tone asked for more than a cliché. So I paused, thought, then said, "Even if this is just a season, I'd still choose it, again and again." Her eyes glistened a little then, And I realized that maybe we all carry a secret fear, that something this good can't last, that it's too fragile, too rare. But maybe the truth is, it doesn't need to last forever to be real. It just needs to be fully lived while it's here. After that, things shifted again. Not in a dramatic way, but like a tide quietly changing its direction. We began to talk more openly about the future. Not the far-off dream of growing old together, but the real, gritty, day-to-day questions. What happens when the roof needs replacing for real? What if her knee gets worse and she needs help going to appointments? What if I get called away to help my brother again? Or she decides she wants to move somewhere warmer? They weren't easy conversations, but they weren't heavy either. Because now, we weren't just living side by side, we were building something. Even if we didn't call it that. Even if we never used the big words like commitment or forever. What mattered was that we were choosing each other every morning. Making space for the complications. Sharing the quiet. Meeting in the middle. Then came the day the generator completely failed. It sputtered once, twice, then gave up like an old man who'd had enough of trying. The sun had barely risen, and the temperature outside was threatening to turn the pipes into popsicles. But instead of panic, we just laughed. She wrapped herself in 2 scarves and declared she'd make coffee over the fire like a pioneer woman. I put on 3 pairs of socks and went out to see if I could at least rig something temporary. The whole day became an adventure, a comedy of errors, sure, but one that brought us closer. At one point, she stood outside the shed with her hands on her hips and yelled, "If this isn't love, I don't know what is." I laughed so hard I dropped a wrench. And when I came inside, my fingers numb and my nose red, she kissed me on the cheek and handed me a steaming cup of coffee so strong it could have recharged the generator on its own. That night, with the fire blazing and our cheeks still flushed from the cold, we curled up on the couch again. And for the first time, I let myself really say it. Out loud, without hesitation. I don't want to be anywhere else but here. With you. Whatever this is, however long it lasts, I'm in. She didn't respond right away. She just stared at me, eyes wide and searching, like she was looking for the truth beneath my words. Then she nodded. Just once. And that nod said everything. Said yes. Said I feel the same. Said finally. We didn't need to toast to it. Didn't need to carve it in wood. We just let the moment sit between us, warm and certain. As winter began to loosen its grip and the snowbanks along the driveway slumped into muddy puddles, something else softened too. There was a quiet transformation in the air, not just in the trees beginning to reveal their limbs again, or the birds chirping a little earlier, but in the way she and I moved through the house together. It had gone beyond comfort, beyond habit. It had become a kind of rhythm that didn't need music. The way she would hum under her breath while folding towels, or the way I would refill her mug without asking whenever I passed the kettle. We didn't talk about what it meant anymore because we didn't have to. It was in the doing. It was in the knowing glance from across the room when one of us had a thought worth sharing but didn't want to interrupt the peace. It was in the way our chairs scooted just a few inches closer to each other every evening by the fire, until one day they were touching, and neither of us remembered moving them. And it was in the morning walks we took without announcing them, just falling into step as naturally as the snowmelt trickling through the cracks in the gravel. One morning, as we were walking the trail behind the cabin, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I thought maybe it was a note or a grocery list, but when she handed it to me, I saw it was a drawing. Rough, sketched in pencil. It was the outline of a garden. Not just any garden, a detailed plan. Beds for tomatoes and herbs, a little arch for beans to climb, a bench tucked under a tree. There was even a spot labeled Wild Corner, a patch, left alone for whatever nature decided to grow there. "I've been dreaming about it," she said, not looking at me, just watching where our boots pressed into the softening earth. Not just the garden, but something rooted. Something we grow together. I didn't say anything for a while. Just stared at the paper, at the potential inside it. All the blank space waiting to be filled with color, effort, time. Then, I folded it carefully and slid it into my own pocket. "Then let's plant it," I said. That was all she needed to hear. She smiled, tucked her arm around mine, and we kept walking. That week we started clearing the patch beside the house. It was still too early for planting, but we raked away the dead leaves and mapped out where the beds would go. We ordered seeds and compost and talked about building a small greenhouse. The project gave us purpose, but more than that, it gave us forward motion, something to tend to together. And in those shared tasks, we started talking about other things that needed planting too. Hope, forgiveness, dreams that had once been packed away like heirlooms too fragile to use. She confessed that she'd spent years building walls around herself, not out of bitterness, but out of exhaustion. Every time I opened the door, she said, someone either left too soon or stayed too long and took more than they gave. I told her I understood, not because I had the same experience, but because I knew the fear of trusting something that felt too good. I'd lived most of my life waiting for the other shoe to drop, which meant I'd never really let myself enjoy the feel of the floor beneath me. But now, in this space we were carving out together, one seed, one shovel of dirt at a time. It felt like we were learning how to build something that didn't have to be perfect to be lasting. There was one afternoon, mid-March, when we drove into town for supplies. Nothing dramatic happened. No grand declarations or moments of tension, just errands. We stopped at the feed store, picked up paint samples, shared a sandwich in the truck. But when we got home, she paused in the driveway before getting out. Today felt like a life, she said. Not dramatic, just observant. Not a moment, not a memory, but a life. Ours. And that stayed with me. Because so much of my past had been a string of disconnected scenes. Jobs that didn't lead anywhere. Relationships that started fast and burned out faster. Places I passed through instead of stayed in. But this was different. This was a story I wanted to be part of from start to finish. Not just a chapter or a page. The days warmed, the soil thawed. We planted early greens under cold frames and watched them push up like little declarations of resilience. She painted the bench for the garden, deep blue, and I built the trellis from reclaimed wood. We argued over tomato placement, laughed about how seriously we were taking the compost ratio, and celebrated the first signs of basil like it was a national holiday. And on one of those garden days, she looked over at me, hair pulled back, hands covered in dirt, and said, I used to think I had to settle for quiet endings, that maybe life would just slow down into nothing. But now I think, maybe this is just the middle. Maybe there's more. I didn't respond with a quote or a clever line. I just kissed her knuckles and said, definitely more. Because that's what it felt like. Like we weren't winding down. We were finally winding up. Spring turned into early summer, and with it came longer days, fuller evenings, and a deeper kind of stillness. The kind that doesn't feel empty, but whole. She started painting again more seriously. I found myself fixing things around the property just because it felt good to make something better. We hosted a few neighbors one weekend, grilled by the fire, played cards on the porch, and at one point, she reached over and rested her hand on my thigh without thinking. That one gesture said everything. Not performative, not for show, just belonging. And later that night, as we washed dishes together, she said, I want to keep doing this. The dishes? I teased. No, she laughed. This. All of this. With you. I dried my hands, turned her to face me, and said, then let's keep choosing it. Every day. And we did. We chose it through the little things, the way we left notes on the fridge, how we took turns making coffee, how we walked the trail even when we were tired. We chose it when we argued about silly things, then apologized just as quickly. We chose it in the way we listened, in the way we stayed. And in that choosing, love became less of a mystery and more of a practice. Not something that showed up with fireworks, but something we built with intention. Like a garden, like a home, like a life that maybe started late, but started exactly when it was supposed to. Summer deepened like a slow exhale. The days stretched long and lazy, and everything, the house, the garden, even the quiet moments in between, seemed to hum with a steady kind of peace we'd both lived too long without. That peace wasn't loud. It didn't come with fireworks or applause. It came in the form of ripening tomatoes, of shared glances across the breakfast table, of freshly laundered sheets hung in the sun. I found myself looking forward to mundane things. Grocery lists, finding the right drawer for the can opener, even picking weeds while she read on the porch. We had built a kind of life that didn't demand attention but offered something much better. Presence. Real, rooted presence. I didn't know it was possible to feel so much from so little until I found myself standing at the edge of the yard one morning, coffee in hand, watching the breeze lift the corner of the tarp in the greenhouse, and feeling more at home in that breath than in entire cities I had lived in before. That was the thing. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about me. It was about the life that formed in the space between us, a third thing we created by accident and tended to on purpose. She began painting with more confidence, letting the canvases stack up in the sunroom like unopened letters to her younger self. I built her shelves. Then I built her frames. Then, without even realizing it, I built her a studio. It wasn't big, just a converted shed with skylights and a heater we got secondhand. But the first time she stepped inside and saw what we'd turned that dusty old shack into, she stood there with her hand over her mouth, speechless in the best way. And that silence meant more to me than anything she could have said, because it was the silence of someone who felt seen, valued, loved. And then one morning, while she was brushing her hair in the mirror, she turned to me and said, "You know, I still worry sometimes that this is all too good. That one day, you'll wake up and realize you want something younger, simpler, less lived in." It stopped me cold, not because it surprised me, but because I realized I hadn't told her enough, not nearly enough, that everything I wanted was already in the room. I walked over, took the brush from her hand, and brushed her hair myself. Slow, gentle, deliberate. "You're not lived in," I said. "You're lived. And that's what I love most. I don't want a blank page. I want a story. And you've got chapters in you that still haven't even been written." She didn't say anything right away, but she closed her eyes, leaned into my touch, and I felt that wall she kept tucked behind her ribs finally ease. She didn't need constant reassurance, but she needed to know that I saw her, not as an idea, not as a convenience, but as the person I would choose, every day, even in the quiet. Eventually, we began to talk about the future, not as something distant, but as something we were already living. She mentioned the idea of opening the garden to neighbors, maybe even starting a small co-op. I suggested putting in a second path, behind the studio, a shortcut to the woods. We laughed about the idea of getting a dog, debated about what kind. She wanted something scrappy and loyal. I wanted something lazy and big enough to lean against. The point wasn't what we chose. It was that we were choosing together. The world we were building had room for expansion, not just survival. We didn't need more to feel full. But it felt good to dream, to imagine beyond the walls of the house and the edges of the garden. To believe we could keep writing this story for as long as we were lucky enough to turn the pages. One afternoon, while going through an old box in the attic, she found a letter she'd written to herself years ago. It was yellowed, edges fraying, tucked inside an envelope with no stamp. "To open when you're finally ready," it said. She hesitated before reading it, as if afraid that whatever was written might unravel what she'd worked so hard to build. But when she finally opened it, she smiled, laughed softly, and handed it to me. The letter was short, just a few lines, but it said everything. "If you're reading this, you didn't give up. That's enough. Keep going. Love like it's the last day of summer." We tacked it to the inside of the pantry door, like a secret reminder only we would see, a private promise to keep choosing joy, even when the world made it hard. Especially then. The final turning point came not with drama, but with quiet conviction. One night, as we lay in bed with the windows open and the sound of crickets washing over us like a lullaby, she whispered, "Would you stay with me, even if I'm 53 next month?" It was half a joke, half a plea, but I could feel the real question underneath. "Do you still see me?" Do you still choose me? Do you still think this is worth it, even now? And I rolled toward her, brushed the hair from her cheek, and said the only thing that mattered. Forever, if you'll have me. No big proposal, no rings, just truth, just us. Because sometimes the greatest commitments aren't made in front of crowds or written in ink. They're made in whispers, in the quiet, in the space between two people who've already seen the worst and chosen each other anyway. That fall, we planted garlic. It was her idea. It overwinters, she explained. You plant it before the frost, and by spring it starts fresh, stronger. That felt fitting. Because we were doing the same, burying the old, letting the cold pass over, and waiting, patiently, for what would bloom next. As the first frost settled on the ground and the trees let go of their final leaves, we stood on the porch in thick sweaters, mugs of cider in our hands, and watched the horizon bleed into dusk. The world was still turning, still changing. But for once, we weren't chasing anything. We were exactly where we were supposed to be, and as we went back inside, her hand finding mine, the porch light flicking on behind us, I realized something I hadn't been able to name before. This wasn't just a story about falling in love. It was a story about staying, about showing up long after the newness wears off, about choosing someone not because they complete you, but because they expand you, make you better, safer, stronger. Like planting garlic in the fall, like brushing someone's hair in the quiet, like answering the same question with the same vow, every day, without fail. Would you stay with me? Yes. Always yes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.